What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 9 Sleeper Picks.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to give you some of my top DFS Sleeper Picks, super low priced and low ownership players that could crush value this week and give your lineup an advantage over the field. These are risky plays, meant for large tournaments only. Don't go all in on any of these guys. They are high risk, high reward picks. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, Week 9, let's take a look at the quarterback position. One of my favorite sleeper picks at the quarterback position is Ben Roethlisberger from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Ben Roethlisberger has averaged 18.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.4 rush attempts per game. Now, he hasn't scored a ton of fantasy points the last 3 games, only scoring 15, 16, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games, but he's got a great matchup here versus the Dallas Cowboys, who've been giving up a ton of fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks and wide receivers and opposing offenses in general here. He's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 19.8 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's $6,500 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game, with the Pittsburgh Steelers favored by 14.5. So the Steelers are going to be scoring most of those projected points. Fantastic matchup. So I like Ben Roethlisberger here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Another sleeper pick I like is Matt Ryan from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Denver Broncos, who have a middle of the pack defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matt Ryan has averaged 20.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.4 rush attempts per game. He's been playing really well this year. He scored 19, 20, and 35 fantasy points in the last 3 games, only going to be about 2% owned, projected at 19.2 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's $6,400 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Falcons favored by 4. Nice matchup for Matt Ryan, who's been playing much better ever since he got Julio Jones back from injury. So I like Matt Ryan here versus the Denver Broncos. Okay, now this last sleeper pick at the quarterback position, you gotta stay tuned to the injury update. If his COVID-19 test is negative this morning, he'll be eligible to play. He'll get the start. I like Matthew Stafford from the Detroit Lions playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Matthew Stafford has averaged 19.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.4 rush attempts per game. He scored 27 and 21 fantasy points in the last 2 games. He's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 18.1 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's $6,600 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Lions trailing by 3.5. So just a fantastic matchup here, and I think his ownership is suppressed a little bit because everyone saw the COVID-19 news. Nobody thought he'd be playing this week. But if that COVID-19 test does come back negative, I like Matthew Stafford here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. One of my sleeper picks here at the running back position is Todd Gurley from the Atlanta Falcons playing the Denver Broncos, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and although they've been pretty good versus opposing running backs, Todd Gurley has averaged 15.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 17.5 rush attempts per game and 2.5 pass targets per game. He got 18, 23, and 20 rush attempts in the last 3 games, so fantastic rushing volume for Todd Gurley, who's only going to be about 4% owned, projected at 15.7 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's 6,200 DraftKings salary and 700 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game. The Falcons favored by 4. They could take an early lead here. Todd Gurley could get a ton of volume in this one, get some goal line carries. He could have a big day. So I like Todd Gurley here versus the Denver Broncos. Another sleeper pick at the running back position is Melvin Gordon from the Denver Broncos playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the 4th worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Melvin Gordon has averaged 15.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 15 rush attempts per game and 4.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 5% owned, projected at 13 fantasy points here in Week 9, and he's only 5,300 DraftKings salary and 1,300 more on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Denver Broncos trailing by 4. That game script does not concern me because Melvin Gordon got 7 pass targets last game, so he's involved in the passing game. Even if the Broncos fall behind, he is their best offensive player by a big margin, so I like Melvin Gordon here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, if you're looking to save some salary at the running back position, another sleeper pick is Devin Singletary from the Buffalo Bills playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have the 2nd worst defense overall and they're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. Devin Singletary has averaged 10.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 11.6 rush attempts per game and 3.8 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 2% owned, projected at 10.4 fantasy points here in Week 9. He's only 4,700 DraftKings salary and 1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 55 points scored in this game, with the Buffalo Bills trailing by 3. So pretty decent matchup here. Super high scoring game, a close competitive game. So although Devin Singletary hasn't been putting up a ton of fantasy points, he'll get the opportunity to do so here this week. So I like Devin Singletary here versus the Seattle Seahawks.
Real quick guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. My favorite sleeper pick at the wide receiver position is Juju Smith-Schuster from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Juju Smith-Schuster has averaged 13.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.1 pass targets per game. He's only going to be about 3% owned here,
projected at 13.1 fantasy points here in week 9. He's 6,200 DraftKings salary and 300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game, with the Steelers scoring most of those points, favored by 14.5. Fantastic matchup here. He has one of the best quarterback matchups on the slate. So I like Juju Smith-Schuster here versus Dallas Cowboys. Another sleeper pick at the wide receiver position is Christian Kirk from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Miami Dolphins, who have a good defense overall, and they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Christian Kirk has averaged 12.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. He scored 21, 23, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 11.6 fantasy points here in week 9. He's 5,300 DraftKings salary and 600 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Arizona Cardinals favored by 5.5. So great matchup. Christian Kirk has been playing phenomenal so far this season, getting a ton of pass targets. So I like Christian Kirk here versus the Miami Dolphins. Another sleeper pick at the wide receiver position is Henry Ruggs from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the LA Chargers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Henry Ruggs has averaged 8.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.6 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 3% owned, projected at 10.2 fantasy points here in week 9. He's 4,900 DraftKings salary and 800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 52.5 points scored in this game, with the Raiders favored by 1. So a high-scoring game, a close, competitive game, and Henry Ruggs is coming off of a bad weather game, which doesn't suit him because he's a speedster. In the good weather, he can get down the field in a hurry. He's a big play wide receiver. He's a boom or bust fantasy player. And I think he has a nice bounce back game here this week. So I like Henry Ruggs here versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Another sleeper pick I like at the wide receiver position is Randall Cobb from the Houston Texans playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Randall Cobb has averaged 11.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.4 pass targets per game. He scored 18, 11, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 10 pass targets last game. He's only going to be about 2% owned, projected at 9.8 fantasy points here in week 9. He's 4,500 DraftKings salary and 900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49.5 points scored in this game, with the Texans favored by 6.5. So pretty decent matchup here. He's been one of Deshaun Watson's favorite targets, so I like Randall Cobb here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. If Matthew Stafford is in for this game, I like TJ Hawkinson from the Detroit Lions playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. TJ Hawkinson has averaged 12.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.9 pass targets per game. He scored 14, 17, and 10 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 10 pass targets last game, only going to be about 2% owned, projected at 11.9 fantasy points here in week 9. He's 5,100 DraftKings salary and 900 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Lions trailing by 3.5. So great matchup. It's a passing game script. So I like TJ Hawkinson here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Another sleeper pick at the tight end position is Eric Ebron from the Pittsburgh Steelers playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the 5th worst defense overall, and they give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Eric Ebron has averaged 9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. He scored 15 and 11 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 5 and 8 pass targets. He's only going to be about 2% owned, projected at 9.3 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $4,500 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. So great matchup here versus the Dallas Cowboys. So I like Eric Ebron here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Another sleeper pick at the tight end position is Evan Ingram from the New York Giants playing the Washington football team, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Evan Ingram has averaged 8.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.8 pass targets per game. He scored 12 and 11 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 10 and 9 pass targets. He's only going to be about 3% owned, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $4,300 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43 points scored in this game, with the Giants trailing by 2.5. So this is a close, competitive game. A great tight end matchup here for a guy that's getting a ton of passing volume the past couple of weeks. So I like Evan Ingram here versus the Washington football team. Okay, now if you're looking for a couple low-owned, sneaky sleeper picks here at the tight end position, take a look at Jordan Akins and Tyler Eifert. Both of those players are coming back from injury. Akins is going to be about 2% owned, and Eifert is going to be about 1% owned. And both of those players have fantastic matchups here in week 9. Jordan Akins from the Houston Texans is facing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the 3rd worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. He's averaging 9.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.8 pass targets per game. He's only $3,300 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. So I like Jordan Akins here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. And Tyler Eifert from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Houston Texans, who have the 2nd worst defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. He's averaging 4.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.8 pass targets per game, projected at 5.9 fantasy points here in week 9. He's only $2,700 DraftKings salary at $1,800 more on FanDuel. So I think I would prefer Jordan Akins over Tyler Eifert. These are both high risk, high reward plays, but at 1% ownership and super low salary. I also like Tyler Eifert here versus the Houston Texans.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.